A major development is unfolding in the world aluminum market that Washington is largely avoiding. It exposes what happens when economic nationalism overrides practical economics. This is a story about aluminum. It is a story about tariffs meant to strengthen America that instead handed one of the most strategic industrial advantages straight to Europe. It is a story about a supply chain built over decades, severed in months by a single policy, now being rebuilt across the ocean with different beneficiaries. Consider the number 95. In the first quarter of 2025, the United States accounted for 95% of aluminum exports from Quebec. This was not just trade, it was deep dependency. Years of geographic closeness, integrated supply chains, shared regulations, and a free trade agreement had created an industrial connection that worked exceptionally well for both nations. Quebec represents about 90% of Canada's total aluminum production, with sprawling operations owned by Rio Tinto Group, Alcoa Corporation, and Aluminary Alouette, feeding directly into American manufacturing. Car parts, beverage cans, aerospace components, window frames, electrical wiring, all relied on Canadian aluminum. The system was efficient, affordable, low carbon, and geopolitically secure. Then tariffs arrived. In March 2025, the United States reinstated a 25% tariff on aluminum imports. By June, the administration doubled that to 50%. The stated rationale came under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. The logic was that America could not depend on foreign nations, even allies, for metal critical to military hardware, aircraft, vehicles, and infrastructure. Politically, it sounded patriotic. Economically, it was disastrous. The U.S. Midwest Premium, the regional surcharge added on top of global aluminum prices, jumped 82% since early June 2025. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a shockwave through American manufacturing. By November 10th, 2025, the Midwest Premium hit a record $1,950 per ton. Within months, it climbed further. By February 2026, it reached $2,182 per metric ton, over $1 per pound for the first time ever. American manufacturers faced all-in costs exceeding $5,340 per ton, nearly 70% higher than global competitors. Car manufacturers in Germany or aerospace firms in Japan paid standard global prices, while American factories paid 70% more for the same aluminum. This was not protection, it was a competitive disadvantage. Price increases hit every sector. U.S. buyers absorbed 15 to 20% higher costs in the second quarter of 2025. Automotive manufacturers faced $180 to $240 extra per vehicle. Aerospace components rose 8 to 12%. Construction materials jumped 15 to 18%. Beverage packaging climbed 6 to 9%. These numbers compounded across millions of units and workers, forcing calculations about sourcing and the viability of American plants. The tariff meant to protect American industry made it less competitive. Meanwhile, the bigger story unfolded across the Atlantic. As Washington erected a 50% tariff wall against Canada, Europe welcomed the metal. Canadian producers, shut out from their main market, looked east. Europe needed exactly what Canada offered. By the second quarter of 2025, European imports of Quebec aluminum rose to 18% from just 0.2% in the first quarter. The United States' share fell from 95% to 78%. A transformation that normally takes a decade happened in 3 months. The Netherlands alone imported 11,800 tons of Canadian aluminum from April to May 2025. Rotterdam became the gateway for Canadian metal flooding Europe, redistributed to smelters and factories across Germany, France, Italy, Scandinavia, and beyond. By the end of November 2025, Rotterdam had received a total of 326,562 metric tons of Canadian primary aluminum. From January through November, major industrial corporations reacted with the speed and determination typically reserved for situations where the financial incentives are impossible to ignore. Rio Tinto Group sharply cut shipments into the United States and reportedly started buying aluminum from rival producers, then reselling that metal to American customers rather than paying the 50% tariff on its own Canadian output. Alcoa redirected roughly 30% of its uncontracted Canadian production toward European buyers. The most symbolic change came from Aluminary Alouette. North America's largest aluminum smelter increased the share of production sold into Europe from just 4% to an extraordinary 57% within only a few months. Rio Tinto ceased sales into the United States entirely. North America's largest aluminum facility moved from sending 4 cents of every dollar earned to Europe to sending 57 cents. This was far beyond a normal market response. It represented a complete strategic realignment carried out at remarkable speed because the signal coming from Washington was direct and unmistakable. The financial mathematics were straightforward. After accounting for tariff payments owed to the American government, Canadian producers earned less from selling metal into the United States than from shipping the same aluminum across the Atlantic. The tariff effectively reversed the traditional economic logic that had long governed North American aluminum trade. For generations, that relationship had been built on geography, proximity, integration, and mutual advantage. What transformed this from a simple trade diversion story into a long-term strategic issue was that Europe was not merely receiving additional Canadian aluminum. Europe was gaining access to some of the highest quality, most environmentally certified, and most strategically valuable aluminum available anywhere in the world at precisely the moment it was needed most. Quebec aluminum is produced using hydroelectric energy. As a result, it carries one of the lowest embedded carbon footprints among primary aluminum producers globally. At a time when carbon accounting and Scope 3 emissions reporting are reshaping international commerce, that distinction carries enormous significance. Its commercial value continues to increase. Beginning in 2026, the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism applies a carbon cost to imported energy-intensive products, including aluminum. European importers were already rushing to secure long-term agreements with verified low-carbon suppliers before the mechanism reached full financial impact. Canadian aluminum matched those requirements almost perfectly. The tariffs did more than redirect Canadian exports toward Europe. They did so at the exact historical moment when Europe was most eager to receive them. The situation became even more severe because of a factor that policymakers in Washington had not fully anticipated. Reduced Middle Eastern supply linked to the Iran conflict hit Europe particularly hard and intensified competition between the United States and the European Union for low-carbon aluminum. The UAE and Bahrain had quietly grown to represent nearly 1/4 of American unwrought aluminum imports, helping offset part of the Canadian volume that had shifted elsewhere. When regional conflict disrupted those sources, the United States encountered two separate supply pressures at the same time. Bank of America projected that Europe would face an aluminum shortfall of 5.6 million tons in 2026, compared with a deficit of 3.8 million tons in the United States. Both regions were pursuing the same limited supply. Europe, however, had already secured contracts, established transportation networks, and strengthened supply routes through Rotterdam. The United States found itself reacting later, paying record premiums while still struggling to secure enough material. At the same time, the domestic aluminum sector was not responding in the manner tariff supporters had predicted. During the first half of 2025, U.S. aluminum exports fell to 562,170 tons, down from more than 84,670 tons during the same period 1 year earlier. The decline was driven by smelter closures, higher energy expenses, and trade barriers associated with the tariffs. The measures intended to shield domestic production were unable to solve these problems and, in some instances, worsened them. One of the most symbolic moments in the entire episode involved Century Aluminum. The company completed the sale of its inactive Hawville, Kentucky smelter to a digital infrastructure firm. The site contained a massive 480-megawatt power system that had once supported one of the nation's largest primary aluminum operations. That infrastructure would now be converted to support AI data centers. America was, in effect, transforming aluminum smelting capacity into server facilities. The factories that tariffs were supposed to revive were instead being sold and replaced by technology infrastructure, employing only a fraction of the workforce while producing no aluminum at all. Rio Tinto also postponed a planned $500 million smelter modernization project, scheduled for the second quarter of 2025, citing uncertainty surrounding trade policy. This illustrates a deeper challenge affecting capital-intensive industries. The issue extends beyond today's aluminum prices. It concerns whether corporations are prepared to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into facilities expected to operate for 20 or 30 years when they lack confidence about what government policy may look like only 2 years into the future. When investment decisions turn negative and industrial capital refuses to move forward, the resulting shortage becomes structural. The missing capacity is not temporary. It exists in facilities that were never constructed and production that never came online. Now consider what Europe received through this process. It secured a dependable, expanding high-volume source of premium low-carbon aluminum produced with hydroelectric power from one of the most politically stable countries in the world. The timing could hardly have been more favorable. Analyst forecasts indicated that European aluminum prices could climb to between $3,000 and $3,200 per ton by the middle of 2026. Into that increasingly tight market, Canadian aluminum arrived at exactly the right moment. Mercedes-Benz, Apple, and Volvo each entered long-term agreements for low-carbon aluminum as part of efforts to reduce emissions throughout their supply chains. At the same time, an American automaker paying 70% above global benchmark prices for aluminum was watching European competitors secure Canadian supply at competitive rates. lower their carbon emissions, and strengthen the economics of electric vehicles expected to dominate automotive markets throughout the 2030s. The advantage established during 2025 and 2026 is positioned to grow over time. The Fraser Institute summarized the situation directly. According to its assessment, the 50% tariff encouraged major Canadian producers to redirect exports toward Europe, while increasing American dependence on Middle Eastern suppliers. Those suppliers were later affected by disruptions linked to the Iran conflict. The national security argument used to justify the tariffs was based on protecting aluminum supply for strategic and defense purposes. Yet the outcome moved in the opposite direction. After the tariffs, the United States became more exposed to supply risks than it had been before. A measure intended to reduce vulnerability instead increased it. For Canadian producers, the tariffs unexpectedly created an opportunity that previously did not exist. Europe needed Canadian aluminum. Europe actively sought Canadian aluminum. Europe was willing to pay premium prices and establish long-term commercial partnerships, capable of surviving temporary market fluctuations. Canadian aluminum exports reached $1.4 billion in March 2025, with 97% destined for the United States as producers, and buyers rushed inventory across the border before the tariffs came into force. That surge in March represented the final chapter of the old supply arrangement. Afterward, the relationship began to unwind month by month, making a return to previous patterns increasingly unlikely. The CBM carbon pricing system is establishing a lasting regulatory structure that consistently favors low-carbon Canadian aluminum over higher carbon alternatives from Russia, China, and other producers that depend on coal-fired electricity for smelting. Canada, supported by hydroelectric-powered smelters and expanding commercial ties with European customers willing to pay a verified green premium, occupies a particularly strong strategic position. The tariffs did more than alter trade flows during 2025. They accelerated a long-term shift in who purchases Canadian aluminum and under what conditions, a change likely to influence the sector for years ahead. Even when elevated Midwest premiums occasionally make it financially attractive to redirect some aluminum back into the United States, producers remain bound by commitments already signed with European customers. They are also influenced by the memory of what occurred when too much dependence was placed on a single market governed by an administration willing to impose 50% tariffs with minimal warning. Once confidence in a trading relationship is damaged, as it was during 2025, rebuilding that trust is neither quick nor inexpensive. The central lesson of this episode can be stated plainly. A 50% tariff imposed on the leading industrial export of a close ally does not automatically increase national security. It does not automatically restore domestic manufacturing. What the evidence from 2025 and 2026 consistently shows is something different. It increases costs for downstream manufacturers. It encourages dependable suppliers to establish lasting commercial relationships with competing industrial economies. It shifts supply chains toward more distant and potentially riskier sources that may face disruptions of their own. And it transfers advantages linked to the green industrial transition to countries viewed as strategic competitors. Europe received something exceptionally valuable. It gained access to a growing, dependable, premium quality, low-carbon aluminum supply chain at the exact moment it was needed most, and while building regulations that increase the commercial value of that type of metal above all others. The 50% aluminum tariff is likely to be remembered as an example of how a major economic power surrendered a long-term industrial advantage through a protectionist policy introduced without fully accounting for where the aluminum would flow once access to the American market became restricted. The metal moved to Rotterdam. It moved into the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Scandinavia. It entered European electric vehicle production, aerospace manufacturing, and construction projects. It became part of the supply chains, supporting Mercedes-Benz, Volvo, and Airbus. For every ton that moved, the United States absorbed the consequences. First, through higher costs paid by American manufacturers, then through declining competitiveness compared with international rivals. Then, through the gradual recognition that large-scale supply chains anchored by contracts rarely returned quickly once redirected. The aluminum went to Europe. Along with it went something less visible but no less important. The perception of the United States as a dependable, stable, rules-based trading partner among the nations whose industrial cooperation remains essential. If you found this analysis valuable, share your thoughts and continue following for more in-depth coverage of global industry, economics, and geopolitical developments. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.